This is Clark the Knife, and we're going to keep rolling with our Hinderer reviews with the Hinderer Eklipse. The newer entrant, at least newer than the XM18, to Hinderer's sort of staple series. There's a lot to like about this knife, and a couple things to really dislike about this knife, which you can probably predict if you've watched my other Hinderer reviews. I go through reviews in three sections. First, talk about the specs, and then look at the knife tip to tail, look at its overall features, the design, where it works well, where it doesn't, and then grade it on a 10-point scale. Just give an overall sense for how I feel about it and help compare it to other knives. Let's get into it with some specifications. So the Hinderer Eklipse, if you're familiar with the XM18, it is very, very similar. This is a USA-made knife that runs you about $425 in most configurations, including this one you're seeing here, which has their working finish. The working finish is a bead blast, which is then stonewash. Looks awesome. Also hides wear very, very well. Most configurations like this with either andization on the scales. These are titanium scales. You can get some andization both with the stonewash and this battle finish. Pretty much any blade finish, anything like that, as long as there's not DLC involved or some weird hardware, it should be around $425 for most retailers. It's a 3.5-inch blade. This is 165 thousandths thick, which is the same thickness as your standard XM18. This one is 20 CV. You'll also find Eklipses in S45 VN and Magna Cut. You will also find lots on the secondary market in S35 VN, which was their primary seal for quite a while. I will say, I don't love a high edge retention, low toughness steel on something like the Eklipse, which is kind of a beatery knife. It's not really meant to be a slicer in any way, but whatever, 20 CV is a popular steel. 8¼ inches overall, 5.6 ounces, and this is running like all modern Hinderers now, I think literally all, other than like slip joints and stuff like that, on the tri-way pivot system. Let's do some size comparisons, and the first and most obvious, this is a skinny XM18, but here it is compared to your XM18. You can see that the Eklipse is extremely similar in size to the XM18, basically the exact same blade length, basically the exact same handle length. But you can see here, I'll just dive right into this, the differences in design between the Eklipse and the XM18. Rick Hinderer gave a video, I forget how long ago, on sort of the theory between the two of them. What he wanted with the Eklipse was what he called a more sort of straight design. You can see where the XM18 sort of curves down on both ends a little bit naturally, the Eklipse feels more straight across. They both have your two scallops here, but the curve toward the butt is more severe on the XM18 than it is on the Eklipse, which is more of a straight butt here. Also, that butt is more squared off, less curved. The overall arch across the back is more gradual on the Eklipse compared to the XM18. The choil is a sharpening choil rather than a finger choil on the Eklipse, so this, you can't choke up on it. No, I don't think you can get Eklipses with a... actually, no, you can get some thumb stud only Eklipses. Maybe I've seen that. But anyway, in this version and in most Eklipses, this is a sharpening choil, not a finger choil. And the biggest difference, ergonomically speaking, is this portion right here. Where the XM18, it's even with the sort of the top of the blade, and it's got jimping to put your thumb right there. On the Eklipse, the scale actually drops down onto a non-jimped section, and basically your thumb can kind of either pull back or nuzzle forward a little bit. But this is just a very different way to sort of land your thumb onto the blade. And so exactly as Mr. Hinderer himself says, the Eklipse feels like a much straighter, more sort of streamlined design than the XM18. And despite being very similar, the ergonomics, and both very much being Hinderers, the ergonomics do feel quite different on the Eklipse. Let's do some more size comparisons, get through that. Let's compare it to your large Sabenza. About the same size, while obviously being a much beefier, bulkier knife in general. Your Paramilitary 2, about the same comment applies there. One thing to note, just when we're talking thickness, you can see that blade stock significantly thicker than the PM2, which by no means has thin blade stock, though the handle scale thickness is, I mean, it's a little bit thicker, but we're talking about the same ballpark, albeit a much heavier knife because this is a full titanium frame lock. Let's compare this to your 940. You can see your 940 there. Similar length, but a much smaller knife overall. Compare it to your bug up. Much larger than the bug up. Compare it to your Delica. Outright dwarfs your Delica. And then one more that I want to start pulling into size comparisons more. This is an AD20, one of my little AD20 collection. And you can see it's a slightly, if you put them pivot to pivot, the blade is a little bit bigger and the handle is a little bit shorter than your AD20. If we put them butt to butt, you can see the overall knife is a little bit longer. Obviously, the AD20 varies a little bit based on which blade shape you get. In terms of that blade length, but we're talking basically similar in size, small differences. Albeit, actually, let me go back to that thickness comparison. With an AD20S here, you can see the blade stock is much thicker on your Eklipse, though the overall knife is still a bit thinner because of those big chunky G10 scales on the AD20S. Review coming up very soon on the AD20S. I will be able to probably be recording that one around the same time that I record this Eklipse review. So, the Eklipse, often described as the spiritual successor to the XM18, taking much of the same overall design philosophy and much of just the Hinderer parts of Hinderer and trying to make a design that is a little bit less hard use, super focused on ergonomics, and it's meant to have a different ergonomic feel and just feel a little bit sleeker. This one here has the buoy blade, which, like a lot of Hinderers, the actual edge here is not that atypical. Honestly, if you ignore this part up here, it's a pretty typical drop point. Maybe a clip point just because of how low this is. You've got your point about even with your pivot. Big old flat, curved toward the front, but is this really aggressive curved clip point with a swedge in the clip that just looks really cool. You can also get the Eklipse in a range of different blade shapes. I have their take on the slicer grind here, which is really beautiful. Separate review coming up for this hollow ground one. Again, probably recording that at the same time as this one, or about the same time. But you can get this with a spear point grind, you can get it with a buoy grind, you can get it with a slicer grind, you can get it with a Wharncliffe grind. The Wharncliffe Eclipses look super, super cool. And I will say in general, you know, the Eklipse blade shapes are obviously very similar to the XM18 blade shapes, but they often have maybe one little bit of extra flair, maybe an extra swedge here, or an extra carve out there, something like that. And as is typical for Hinderer, they do a little bit more to make these blades look cool than they really have to. You've got a really nice thumb ramp here, which again, making it look this cool is an aesthetic detail, but it's also functional. This is a functional thumb ramp. Your thumb fits very nicely and securely there. It works. The way that they did this curve here, the gradual curve sort of just meeting gradually into the saber grind here, that is unnecessarily nicely done. One of the nice things about the working finish is the working finish, which again is a bead blast that then gets stone wash, which just looks awesome. It also knocks down all of your edges on the grind very nicely, so you get nice smooth transitions, catches the light really nicely, takes on wear really nicely. This is not the factory edge, this is my 17-degree edge on it. We'll talk about cutting performance a little bit later. But, you know, this is typical Hinderer, thick blade stock. That blade stock thickness carried all the way out to here, then tapers not honestly all that much toward the tip. This tip is still pretty thick. And just do the math, 165 thousandths with not a ton of space to drop because of that saber grind. And surprise, surprise, this is a Hinderer that is very, very thick behind the edge and cuts about as well as you'd expect. We'll talk about that in detail in the scoring system, but to put it lightly, all the complaints that I had about the full thickness XM18 3.5 inch, that basically it just did not cut well, pretty much all of those still apply here. Going through the rest of the blade, you've got these thumb studs that also act as blade stops, giving a ton of torsional support there. Basically, if you try to torque this, in most knives, when you try to torque a blade, all that force goes to the pivot. With these blade stops here, it instead gets distributed to the scales, makes it just a little bit tougher, especially against a sort of force that blades tend to be weak in. Again, this area right behind the top of the blade is very different on the Eklipse. Basically, you can land your thumb right there, and it just runs onto jimping that's only on the blade, no jimping on the handle. When you get into your handle here, you've got a big flipper tab that works the finger guard and a big front finger index. Your front finger super, super secure there. And so these front finger and thumb here, these two give you a really secure pinch right behind the blade right there. These two fingers, even with the rest of my fingers doing nothing, are really securely fastened on this knife, give me a ton of control. Whether I'm stabbing, whether I'm like twisting, carving, whether I'm pushing through cardboard. Honestly, these two fingers, well, my finger and thumb alone, my index finger and thumb alone, are really enough to hold onto this knife very, very securely. The way this section of the knife is designed works really well. And if you go back, you've got a fairly unusual step up here, and then a fairly gradual swoop back, second finger index, some jimping on a relatively flat but lightly curved section here, and a more squared off butt than you tend to see on a Hinderer. Now, the ergonomics look kind of weird on this, but when you grip this knife, the ergonomics are actually exceptional and even better than the ergonomics on the XM18. So, at least with the clip this way, I'll talk about the clip in a second. So, the sort of ideal ergonomics for a knife, if you ask me, without digressing like crazy, is a knife that feels very secure in the hand without being abrasive or without you really like feeling any sharp edges. It feels like, it should feel kind of like when you were a kid, when you put your hand into silly putty and you grabbed it and it just molds around your hand and it just feels like it fits your hand and it feels like you can't like pull it out. It's not going to go anywhere. That is what you get here with the Eklipse, and there are very few knives. There's one that comes to mind, but there's very few knives that have a better sensation like that than the Eklipse. This front finger groove right here, which has chamfer, big chamfer right there, big chamfer on the second finger groove right there. With those chamfers, with the way that the edge of this scale is knocked down, with the way that all these edges all over are knocked down. Again, that front thumb and that front finger, very, very secure without any sharp or harsh edges anywhere. Then the rest of your fingers, middle finger lands here. Last two fingers can rest anywhere on this butt, and this gradual curve, which hikes up a little bit, rolls right into your palm. And then by scooping this handle down a bit here, it's kind of like they do it more extreme on the Jurassic. You really feel sort of on top of the blade, a little bit above the blade, and especially when you're doing push cuts, forceful cuts, or forceful stabs, anything like that, you feel like you are really, really in control of the blade in the Eklipse. It does not feel like it's going anywhere, and yet there is not anything that is sharp or abrasive or uncomfortable anywhere on the knife. You know, the XM18, because it's really like a hard use first knife, it is a little rougher on the hands, relatively speaking. You do feel that jimping more. You do feel it sort of cramp back onto your pinky a little bit more with that curve toward the butt. It's hyper secure, but, you know, again, if I bring it out here, if you look at, you know, like this jimping here, this curve toward the back, like this is hyper secure in your hand, but you also feel like you're holding a knife. Like you feel some more of those sharper edges, things like that. Even little things like how there's a chamfer in this first index and not this second index. Just makes you feel a few more of those sharp edges. All of that has been rounded down and softened on the Eklipse while giving you this place to perch your thumb that sort of keeps your force down on the blade here. And then it's all just been made more pleasant to hold. Now, there's a caveat, which is where the clip comes in. I received this Eclipse, and most of you, if you buy them from Hinderer, will probably receive your Eclipse with them with the clip here, with them tip up. I do not recommend that you have your Eclipse tip up. I strongly recommend that if you get a tip up Eclipse, that you reorient the pocket clip and make it tip down, because the ergonomics, when the clip is mounted tip up like this becomes a fat part of the knife. This becomes a skinny part of the knife. And actually, I do not like the ergonomics when the clip is mounted down here. Then you've got a big fat wedge at the bottom of your hand, and it feels like you want a little bit more knife up at the front here where most of the force is. Because when you're gripping this knife, it is really this thumb and this first finger that are doing most of the work. These other three fingers in your palm are kind of along for the ride a little bit until you really push. Having the extra thickness that this stiff titanium clip provides really gives more space right where you need it and makes the ergonomics of this absolutely shine. I carried this Eclipse for a week or two with the clip in the other position, and I was going to give it a much more negative review ergonomically. And then I just switched the clip for the heck of it, and the ergonomics improved substantially. So at least for my hand, in this configuration, it's ergonomically fantastic. In the other configuration, I prefer the XM18 ergonomics very significantly. But all of the differences between the Eclipse and the XM18 make it more comfortable to hold without really sacrificing any of that feeling of it being super secure in the hand. And there are some other small details that just make this feel like a little bit more of premium isn't the right term, but just a nicer knife to have and hold. Again, this design is a little bit more complex. Not that much more, but if you look at when it looks folded up, there's just a couple more lines in the XM18. You know, the way that they made a relatively complex shape on this front face here, which, by the way, serves not really any purpose. I mean, there's plenty of clearance for the thumb stud. They could have just squared this off or made it a less complex shape, but they made it look cool. Your flipper tab here is less aggressive, less hooky than your XM18. It is absolutely more comfortable while still having that fantastic Hinderer action. Shake shut on this one. Thumb studs also, about the same place as an XM18. Very nicely designed thumb studs with this little stepped pattern. Very nicely placed relative to the pivot. You get your thumb under there. It's a stiff detent, but it will fire out. So very nice action with the flipper tab. Very nice action with the thumb stud. I actually find myself using the thumb stud even more on the Eclipse. The ergonomics kind of lend themselves to it. Either way, you're going to be very happy with the action on this knife. On the lock side, you can see typical awesome Hinderer fit and finish. Tons of hardware all over the place, as they tend to do, but especially in this working finish, it just gives a very cool sort of industrial vibe to the whole thing. And all the, gaps on your hardware, gaps on your filler tab, the size of the lock bar cutout, everything is just so tight that it all looks very intentional. I also really love the way that they, satin finish your hardware, even satin finish the thumb stud. Gives a really nice contrasty pop to the muted style of the rest of the knife. And again, just like a Chris Reeve, this working finish, and you can see it on the blade, just gets better the more you use it. It just looks better the more that you use it. One other little detail, if you look at your lock bar cutout here, or sort of where you access the lock bar, here it's just basically a chamfer the whole way. Plenty easy to access. Nice and light tension on the lock bar, actually. So very easy to access, very easy to disengage, shake shut. Again, if we go back to the XM18, it's just a little bit less subtle. They gave the chamfer, but then they also jimped this. It is a little bit more secure, but it's also just a little more abrasive. It's another little quality of life thing they did with the Eclipse to just make it easier to have, easier to hold, just feel like a little bit of a nicer knife. But again, the really impressive thing about the Eclipse, and it does come down to subtle things like this little drop before the blade, the extra chamfers here, and really the way that they did streamline the whole thing while still keeping the most important curves and chamfers and all that. Hinderer did, I believe, succeed in making something that feels much nicer than an XM18. Not much nicer. That feels nicer than an XM18. Feels less like, a 4x4 or an ATV and feels more like a G-Wagon kind of thing. While still having, in my sense and in my use, all of the toughness and all of the security in the hand of the XM18. So now, let's go to the scores. And I think that you can sort of predict where these will land based on those comparisons. And there is a lot of very good about this knife with one big fly in the ointment. So, as per usual, 10 factors, 5 related to sort of the knife enthusiast stuff, your fun factor, 5 related to its function. First, blade design. I'm going to give, especially the Eclipse blade designs, I'm going to give them an A in pretty much any configuration. Again, one of the things I love about Hinderer is they always go a little extra with their blade designs. Buoys are always cool, but I'm not even really reviewing this specifically for the buoy, even though that's the one I have, because the same things I love about this buoy are true for all of Hinderer's designs with the Eclipse. They add things like these little swedges, like that little scoop there, which is very, very functional as a thumb ramp. They just the way that they curve this and don't just chop it off. The way they do all the transitions, they make all their blade designs look way cooler than they need to. The cutting edge on a lot of them is very similar, but you do have those different looks. They're just some of the coolest looking blades on the production market, and it's easy for me to give them an A in that regard. Handle design similarly is an A for exactly the reason that you'd expect based on my comparison with the XM18. They sought to create a handle that was straighter, that was less sort of less aggressive and less like I am built for hard use and nothing else, and is more just a little bit more friendly to hold, but still being a really tough Hinderer handle. It doesn't look like anything else out there, except obviously, the ZTs that are like the 0393, I think it is, which is basically an Eclipse. Nothing else quite looks like this handle out there. It's a strange set of curves that works really, really well in the hand. And it's one of those designs that you kind of wonder, like, why does it look like that? Why are there all those curves there? Just the particular shape of everything is just a little different than a lot of other knives out there, but it works really, really well in the hand. Really, really well. I mean, you do only have one grip, but this one grip, you can choke up if you need to. You could put your middle finger here, put your second finger right there, grab onto the blade like this. You can use that. The knife feels a little thick and a little big to do that, but you can do that. But honestly, this grip here, really, really good. And it's one of those designs that sort of, when you use it and once you learn to really like it, and like it in the hand, it becomes more visually attractive. As you appreciate that. And of course, there's the usual things about Hinderer. The way they do the contrast hardware looks really cool. This G10 texture is unnecessarily good, meaning it's better than it has to be. They could do a plain old peel ply, same thing as Spyderco does, Demco does, all that sort of stuff. Instead, they do this, actually I guess Demco has their diamond pattern, so Demco started doing has done the same sort of thing, but they do their diamond pattern here, which is an exceptionally good pattern in the sense that it is not abrasive. You can run your finger over it with light pressure without any resistance, but it does give you lots of grip when you bear down on it, and it looks cool to boot. So overall handle design here is an A. And frankly, if you soup up an Eclipse with, titanium scales and custom hardware and stuff like that, the knife can look as cool as any custom knife out there, thereabouts. And it is a testament to how well designed that handle is. You can see some really, really badass looking Eclipses out there. Action, I talk about this in every single Hinderer review. This is a shake shut action on bearings pretty much out of the box that only gets smoother with time, and on top of that you have the ability to run this on phosphor, bronze, or Teflon washers if you want to. The fact that Hinderer can do that is a testament to how good their machining is. Really nice detent on this one, very satisfying flipper action, reliable, nice stiff detent, good detent break, just very, very satisfying to flip, and great action with the thumb studs as well. This is solidly in that upper tier of bearing actions, not at the level of Koenig and things like that, not at the level of your custom makers, but certainly competitive with anything else in the market at the $400 sort of price range. Solid A for action. Fit and finish. If you watch any of my other Hinderer reviews, I am just continually impressed with how tight everything is on Hinderer. Their chamfers, super consistent. Their hardware, super flush. Their blade grinds are really, really crisp, really well done. You know, again, the blade finishes they put on here, this working finish doesn't look quite like a lot of other stuff out there. Same finish on the handles, doesn't look quite like a lot of other stuff out there. Even the internals, the little chamfers they put on everything are nice. Their jimping is cut really well. The chamfers on the G10, very, very nice. The only fit and finish issue I ever have with Hinderers is occasionally some of these screws or the pivot will need a little bit of blue Loctite. And once you blue Loctite it, it'll be fine. This is as good as anything at the $425 level, not called Chris Reeve right now. So I would consider this a solid A in fit and finish. And frankly, even if it's not as tight as some of the stuff coming from China, like Riat or the very, very best of Best Tech, I find this more satisfyingly well made. When you get sort of hyper precise stuff like Riat does, it can often feel soulless. This knife still feels like it has a soul. Not because anything's sloppy, but it doesn't feel so robotically precise. But it is still way more precise than it needed to be. Solid A in fit and finish. And the cool factor, overall cool factor is an A. I mean, look at this knife. This is a very, very cool looking knife. Hinderers are big, they're tough, they're heavy duty. They have awesome blade shapes, they have awesome handle shapes. They're just, they feel great in the hand. They're fun to flip, they're fun to carry, they're fun to look at, they're fun to hold. Like everything you do with a Hinderer is some of the cooler stuff you can do with a knife. And they're just how well they're made, the extra level they go for aesthetics, in little details like the chamfers, like the blade grinds, all that. They're just cool knives. I'd put this at an A, and frankly, the fact that there's such a rich aftermarket for titanium scales in all sorts of different colors for aftermarket hardware. Even, if you want to get crazy, you can even do stuff like Cerakoting and things like that. But literally, if you just go with Hinderer's own aftermarket stuff or stuff from like Sharp Dress Knives and things like that, you can make Eclipses that are borderline A pluses in cool factor. And, one of the things you'll see with, it seems like Eclipses in particular, and you saw this with the ZT0393. I mean, there are people with collections full of $2,000, $3,000, $4,000 knives that you lay a bunch of them out on the table, like they do one of those Instagram shots where they got their 30 knives on the table or whatever, and still they'll have some Eclipse that is like one of the coolest things on that entire table. So if this is very, very cool, very satisfying for a $425 per production knife. And the fact is, if you want something that is literally at like that custom level of cool factor, and you're willing to drop another, $300 into a $425 knife, you can do that with a Hinderer. And it's kind of cool to have that flexibility too. It's not something that I take advantage of anymore, but it's cool that it's there for people that want it. So pretty easy to calculate the total score. It's an A across the board in the fun factor. This is a very fun knife. This is a knife that I was looking for excuses to carry. But then when we go over to the function, there's the primary reason that I didn't carry it more, which is that the cutting performance is a C. I think I gave the Hinderer, or the XM18 3.5 a C minus. This one, the grind's a little better, so it's just a C. But the fact is, the issue that I had with my full thickness XM18 absolutely applies here. 165 thousandths blade stock, with not that tall of a grind, with the way Hinderer grinds their knives, which is a relatively shallow grind. You know, if you look at the plunge here, it looks like there's a lot taken off, but, you know, if you look sort of down at the ricasso there, this thing is thick. And you feel that anytime you try to cut anything. This is one of those knives, even with my own edge on it. This is a 17 degree per side edge on my TS Prof Cadet. Even with my own edge on this, this is a knife that the cutting performance is sufficiently bad that there are some cutting tasks I will try to have this do that it will be unable to do. It will not be able to cut certain things. When I use this in the garden, there are all kinds of like little tree branches and stuff like that it will not cut them. Often if I'm trying to cut a tomato or something like that, which I only do for the sake of testing this because it will mash the tomato every single time. It will not slice it. It will not cut it. Paper, it sort of cuts. Note cards, it sort of cuts if you have a very fresh edge on it, but that's just a really good sharpening job, a really good edge doing the work. The second that you pass this through material, whether it's cardboard, whether it's drywall, whether it's carpet, whether it's, you know, cutting open a box, anything like that, this blade is thick. This blade does not cut well. And so, frankly, I love carrying this knife every single time, and it feels super secure in the hand until I have to use it. And then the second that I have to cut something with it, I have to contend with the fact that the edge just doesn't do the job, and it's a knife that just doesn't cut things well. Which brings me to utility, which I'm going to call a C+, only because these ergonomics are so extraordinarily good that that it is actually more pleasant to force this to cut things than a lot of other knives with equally bad cutting performance. These ergonomics are so secure in the hand and so comfortable that, like, for example, I used this on a day that I was cutting a bunch of zip ties. I had to push this with just about all my might. I mean, granted, I'm sort of going with the tip and trying to sort of cut through the zip tie, but I had to pull really, really hard or push really, really hard to get this blade to cut through a zip tie. To the point that, like, after I did the first one, I did not do it anymore toward myself because I was afraid that I was going to, shoot through the zip tie and, cut myself, like impact myself. Now, granted, the blade's so dull, it probably wouldn't have done anything. But the benefit, though, is that this handle is so comfortable, especially in this grip here where you're up on the little blade ramp the buoy makes, that even when I'm pushing through stuff like crazy, it's frustrating, it's stupid, but it is not nearly as unpleasant as it should be because it still isn't harsh on your hand, just because those ergonomics are so good. So I have used this knife around the house way more than I really should, given its cutting performance. I've used it for EDC way more than I really should. I've used it in the garden way more than I really should, because that edge, that actual blade, is frustrating to use, but the ergonomics are so good that it still feels more useful than it should. So it's a C+ in utility, which is basically exceptional ergonomics being held back by a really terrible functional blade. It looks awesome, but it just doesn't work that well as a cutting tool. Feel is an A. This is very, very close to an A+. There are not that many knives I can think of that are more comfortable in the hand, especially under heavy use, than the Eklipse. And in fact, the one that I'm sort of thinking of that I'm holding out for the A+ is probably, this feels very much like the Inkosi, like Chris Reeves' Inkosi, which is one of my very few, when I get there, that's one of my very few A+ ergonomic knives. This melts into the hand. It really does give you that sensation of like squeezing your hand into a ball of silly putty and having it like fill up all the crevices, and it feels glued to your hand without feeling harsh anywhere, whether you're gripping it back here or whether you're gripping it up here. Like, again, those are only the two grips that really work, but they do really work. Part of the problem, and this is kind of double penalizing, but because the blade cuts so poorly, it really needs to be ergonomically great because you're going to feel all that force. You know, when the blade cuts poorly, every single cut requires more force, requires more pressure, and you're absolutely going to feel that. And so it's less comfortable than it could be just because of the force you have to apply. But still, this is an ergonomically exceptional knife. They really did do what they needed to with the with building the Eclipse relative to the XM18, and they made a knife that is no less secure in the hand and is, if anything, meaningfully more comfortable. Really just a fantastic design. Solid A in feel. Carry, I'm going to call a C+. This is probably, again, a way of penalizing for the cutting performance. The fact is, this is a heavy, relatively chunky knife at 5.6 ounces. This is 5.6 ounces is at the point where you do really start to feel the weight. If this is hanging in your pocket, you feel it swinging around all day. That jump from say 4.5 ounces to 5.5 ounces is a really big jump, at least for me, where that goes from a knife feeling not that heavy to feeling noticeably heavy. You are getting a lot of knife. You are getting some pretty exceptional ergonomics for that, but also this full thickness Hinderer design. It's, you know, it's thick in the pocket. It's not just big. It's not just heavy. It is thick. I mean, this feels like a bit of a pocket hog. Not enough that it's all the way down to a C, but this is not an easy carry. It's not a hard carry either. And honestly, if I got a screaming sharp edge out of it, I would probably make this a B-, just because I would be getting more performance relative to the carry. As it stands, it's a bit frustrating to use because I'm carrying a relatively large object in my pocket that I can't actually cut that much stuff with, which is frustrating. And then value I'm going to call a B+. That's the rating that I give to pretty much all Hinderers because $425 for the level of fit, finish, and design that you get in here. Again, Hinderer is doing a lot of things unnecessarily good. From a lot of these curves here, just are not functionally necessary. Again, I go back to this stuff at the front here, these little chamfers up front, or all those little lines, because that is purely designed to make this line sort of parallel to this line on the flipper tab. The way that the curve of the flipper tab, just precisely matches the curve of that front finger index. The fact that they even pull off these stops, that they make it so it lines up perfectly with the scales, the really nice chamfers everywhere, the really nice blade finishing. Again, I've talked about the blade enough. Like the little things like, the milling on the lock bar relief, like they're doing a lot of things that they do not need to do. And a lot of that stuff that you don't need to do is stuff that you tend to not get sometimes when you're looking at Chinese-made knives in that $300, $350 range, stuff like that. You get like the big design features, they'll nail those. The small design features, sometimes they don't. Sometimes they overlook them. Hinderer does not overlook anything from a design perspective. And frankly, the fit and finish you get, the strengths of the design you get here, I have no issue with $425 for this knife. So the function is a B, which honestly feels like a bit of a deceptive score for me because the most important thing it really, really sucks at, and it's only held up by the fact that those ergonomics are really, really stellar. And so it ends up as a B+ knife, which feels about right as an overall score. Because this is a really cool knife, this is a really fun knife, and honestly, there are some people that do not care all that much about cutting performance in their knives. They don't need something that slices well. They don't need something that can, pierce stuff well. They don't need something that can cut all that well. And in that case, this is a really, really fun knife. This is a really cool knife. This is a knife that feels good in the hand. This is a knife that looks cool on the table. This is a knife with a fit and finish that will be satisfying to all but the most discerning people. So if you are somebody who cares more about how your knives look and how your knives feel than you do about how they cut, there's very little negative about the Eclipse. And there's a lot of positive. Unfortunately, if you, like me, are somebody that likes to use your knives to cut things, then like a lot of Hinderers with 165,000 stock, everything basically except the Project X. Though I haven't tried some recent Jurassic, so I don't know whether the Jurassic would have the same problem as well. It might not because that blade is so tall. These thick Hinderers, they just don't cut. And so it is really a knife that is undone by one pretty fatal flaw. And the fact is, I have not carried this Eclipse all that much despite all the positive things I have to say about it, because I always have to carry another knife because it just doesn't cut well enough. And that is even with me doing as much as I reasonably could to try to get some edge performance out of it with the resharpening. I'm going to talk coming up about the hollow grind. And the hollow grind, spoiler alert, solves the cutting performance problem pretty significantly. But honestly, what I would love to see a skinny Eclipse. Actually, I had a comment, and it was a good idea. It would be really cool to see a skinny blade on full thickness scales, and you get a very similar ergonomic experience with just much better cutting performance. I will repeat, I really think that 140 thousandths, what's on this skinny XM18 here, should be the standard thickness for Hinderers, and this 165 should be the fatty, not 190. And the Eclipse would be a phenomenal knife with 140 thousandths thick blade stock. It would, frankly, I think be superior to the XM18. And frankly, this Eclipse in 165 thousandths is superior to the XM18 in 165 thousandths, unless you unless you either really like a front finger choil or you really need that full ergonomic strength that an XM18 gives you. Like you need that totally locked in feel, like you're literally an EMT or something like that. For everybody else, the Eclipse is a little bit cooler, a little bit more ergonomic, a little bit just more fun, and still gives you all the things that you love about Hinderer. It's definitely, to me, feels like a design evolution, not a step back. And it's cool that Hinderer has it in the same way that it's cool that Chris Reeve has both the Sebenza and the Inkosi, in the sense that you can get two very different feels despite them being very similar knives. As it stands, this knife is easy to recommend for Hinderer fans because it gives you everything you love about Hinderer in the most probably visually interesting and ergonomic package for this sort of general vibe. It's less ugly than the Jurassic. In fact, it's cooler than both the XM18 and the Jurassic, while being ergonomically superior in most cases to the XM18. It's just you got to understand before you buy this whether cutting performance matters. Because if cutting performance matters, you're going to have some challenges. So that's my review of the Hinderer Eklipse 3.5 inches. It's been Clark the Knife. I hope you found this either interesting or informative or at least a little bit useful. Thank you for spending the time with me. Drop any thoughts you have about the Hinderer Eklipse down in the comments. Would love to know your thoughts, your experience with the knife, and let me know if there's anything else that you'd like me to review. Hope you have a good day. I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.